for CAL FIRE. Martha Karstens is the Chief of the Big Sur Volunteer Fire Brigade. Our moderator is none other than Mr. Gore.
Thank you very much. Good lunch.
And joining us all the way from Australia is Ken Thompson, former Deputy Fire Chief of New South Wales and now the CEO of Thompson Consulting. Thank you, Ken.
Well, I hope everybody had a good lunch, the last sessions were great, and I want to express my personal thanks to Chief Kim Pimlott and Chief Martha Karstens, and to my friend Ken Thompson, who has been in firefighting in Australia for 38 years, working his way up through the ranks, out on the fire, out on the line, and in management positions. And before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge that 6 fire and rescue personnel in California have lost their lives protecting people against fires, and we want to express our grief and thanks and condolences to their families and loved ones. And ladies and gentlemen, I feel a lot of emotion that I'm sure you do as well. And on behalf of all of us, through you two, I'd like to say thank you for the courage and heroism of the firefighters during this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And by the way, why don't you just stay standing, because I want to acknowledge our thanks and express it through Ken Thompson, because this is the second year in a row that Australia and New Zealand have sent over 100 firefighters to California to help us with the fires there. Thank you. So, Chief Pimlott, you and your CAL FIRE teams have really been through it. Something's different with fires in California now, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if we don't think the climate's changing, you haven't been on the front lines of fires in California in the last several years. I've been doing this for 30 years. I work with a lot of experienced professionals around the state who have more years of experience than that. Things are different. Weather patterns are different. We've always had fire sieges in California. We've Santa Ana winds in Southern California, the Oakland firestorm in the early 1990s. But what's happening is we're getting weather events that are more extreme. Right here in Southern California, last December during the Thomas fire, we had what we call a red flag warning for low humidities and high winds. It lasted for 13 straight days. That's unheard of, to have those kinds of conditions for that length of time. It's happening more and more. Our fires are spreading at rates unlike they've ever spread. Firefighters can't get out in front of these fires now and stop them when they're burning in those conditions. They're having to back up and find other places to control them at ridge tops and other places. The average, they usually be the exception to the rule to have a fire that was more than 100,000 acres. Now that's common. We've had several already this year. Literally, while we're speaking here today, the largest fire in the state's history in Mendocino County, the Ranch Fire, is still burning, 410,000 acres.
Wow, wow. And some of the temperatures reach these extreme levels. I know in the Carr fire, we were talking earlier, but I also read about this. Some of you, I showed the video yesterday of the fire tornado that was part of the Carr fire. 100 consistently wind speeds of over 140 miles an hour, peaking at 165 miles an hour during a fire tornado. And you were temperatures of 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. There's just no way to comprehend that. And how wide was that fire tornado?
It was over a half a mile wide.
Wow, at the base of the
At the
half
base
a mile.
of it.
Wow, that's really incredible. And Chief Carstens, you've had the unusual, tragic experience of fighting fires as chief of your volunteer brigade, and at the time you're fighting the fires, your own home burned down. Is that right?
Yes, it was, you know, there's homes burning down right now as we speak, more than likely, and hundreds and thousands of people lose their homes every year. But this was in December, and it should not be happening in December, which is what we were saying earlier. It's a year-round fire season now in California. And one of the reasons, just to sidetrack why I'm here, is I really believe in this climate reality project and global warming, and you can't help but look at the fires now that are burning and see this is why. So, yeah, it was in December, 10 days before Christmas. This should not happen. And we were paged out for a fire just down the ridge from where I lived, and when I walked out my front door, it was there at my front door.
Wow.
So we do what we do best and go into fire mode and hook up my truck to the pump and started doing what I can, and eventually some of my firefighters came in, and we stayed at my home, the bulk of us, all night, because then, and I don't want to say this with you here, we were actually unable to get out. We were stuck where we were due to fire being on either side. So,
wow.
And we're well aware of being safe, but that's the way it was. But we spent the better part of the evening just trying to save my home. We couldn't go to try and save other people's homes because we couldn't leave. It was devastating to watch your own home burn down. I walked out the front door to what I thought I was going to someone else's fire, and I never thought this is the last time I walk back into my home again. We know well that it can happen. It could still happen. I've now rebuilt. I've been in there for 2 years, and it could happen any time now, and that's unfortunately the whole state of California is a tinderbox. Everywhere we live, this is the way it is.
Wow.
So,
well, bless you. And it's just almost impossible to imagine the depth of emotion you had to feel being trapped there, fire all around you. We showed a video yesterday of that father and son driving. Was that Glacier National Park? I believe it was, and the firefighters rescued them finally when they turned around and went back. I want to return to this, but I want to talk to Ken Thompson. And Ken, thank you for going to the trouble to join us by video. Are you in Melbourne or?
I'm straight to the I was one of your original ambassadors in Australia many years ago.
Okay, well, great. Ken, you have studied this, and as a professional firefighter for all of your career, you were one of the firefighters in Australia who came to realize what Chief Pimlott was saying earlier. Something's changed here. Now, the firefighters in Australia have come to the same realization that Chief Pimlott just told us about. How would you put it in your words?
But I was just listening to Ken, and I thought it's exactly the same in Australia. Just to put it into context, Australia is the second driest continent behind Antarctica. It's also one of the most fire-prone parts of the world. 80% of our population is on the coast, which is the most fire-prone part of the world. We've seen massive increase in fires, the frequency of fires, the intensity of fires, the amount of damage being caused by fires. At the moment, most of the east coast of Australia is in drought. My state is at 100% drought affected. It's one of the worst droughts. I think the farmers are saying it's the worst drought they've ever experienced. And there's a lot of debate about whether this drought is caused by climate change or exacerbated by climate change. I think most people would say at the very least it's been exacerbated by climate change. And accompanying that has been a massive increase in fires. Our fire season used to run for about 6 months. Now it's running for at least 9 months. We only get about 3 months now to be able to to get in and reduce whatever hazard we can do, we can reduce, and to educate the public as best we can. Now we're in August, and August is winter in Australia, so we're the opposite to the US. And last week we had 1,600 what you would call wildfires burning across the East Coast. That's in August. That's unheard of. We have total fire ban days when the conditions reach certain thresholds. Those fire ban days generally aren't brought in before about September or October. Last week we had the earliest total fire ban ever declared. So something is obviously changing.
Yeah.
And based on my research and my experience and talking to lots and lots of other people, particularly firefighters, the climate is changing, and we're seeing the effects of that on the front line by more and more fires, more frequently and more severe. One fire just a few years ago destroyed 3,500 houses and killed nearly 200 people.
So you're in the middle of you're toward the end of your winter now, but
Yes.
and same thing, Chief Carson's lost her fire in December, which didn't used to be fire season in California, but even though it's in winter down there, you've got one of the worst droughts in the history of New South Wales, that big state where Sydney is located. And so same thing, if it's happening in California, also happening in in Australia, it's happening in Greece, it's happening in Portugal, all across southern Europe, happening in Sweden, 6 fires above the Arctic Circle. Fire broke out in Greenland, for God's sake. Chile lost 1 million acres. You can go right around the world. Mongolia right now, Germany yesterday, still going on. It's a global phenomena, obviously, and what they all have in common is that the conditions are changing. We're trapping more heat, the vegetation and soils are drying out, and whatever the cause of the fire, then it just spreads very, very quickly, and they don't have a chance to get ahead of it, and it burns hotter and it burns longer and burns more areas. So I'll never forget being in Australia. I think it's about 7 years ago, and I did a climate event in Melbourne, and I was surprised when a lot of your folks, the guys and gals in their fire dress uniforms, came in, walked up on stage and took the microphone and said, we've been studying this and we've consulted the scientists and we've decided as a group, we're first responders to fire, we're going to be first responders to global warming. And they organized themselves, and they organized a relay race over a big part of Australia, stopping in each town to deliver the message about global warming, and I think that's really, really, really commendable. But you're kind of driven to this. I want to ask some practical questions here. For those who live in California or elsewhere where fires break out, what can people do to help you all? And same thing in Australia, I want to hear you as well. But you're away from your families for a much longer period of time. Your spouses or partners and kids are doing without your presence there as you're out protecting everybody else. What can we do to help you?
Well, certainly, sense of community is so important. As Vice President Gore said, our firefighters are gone now for pretty much most of the fire season. They may come home for short periods of time, but we're talking weeks and weeks of deployment across the state, or in many cases outside of the state. And I think it's that peer support, it's the community support, knowing they have a network at home, that their families are taken care of. It's really not a lot different than soldiers that are deploying overseas, and you have that network to take care of at home. But we did sign up for this, and firefighters know their risks, and we're facing greater risks. The fires that everyone just talked about here a few moments ago are placing firefighters in jeopardy more and more every day. And so it's how are we going to help manage that risk? And I don't certainly have all of the answers. We've got to do a lot of work out there. Public education, obviously working around our homes and improvements to remove vegetation, to protect the homes, the defensible space. There's a lot of work that needs to get done to give firefighters that fighting chance when they're out there defending homes.
All right. Did you want to answer that?
Well, I would say specifically, just to bring it down more to your level, I did meet someone, I believe it was from North Carolina, so I guess there's people here from all over the country.
Yeah, and 40 other countries too.
Yeah, and thank you for that. But specifically, and I'll just use an example, we live up on a ridge, a dry ridge. My neighbor would obviously do their required clearing, and maybe then some if they live high on a hill. If they have a pool, they would go out and buy a pump so they can pump water to help fight the fire. They might buy a generator to help keep the power on with the fire coming and the power goes out. They do a lot of things. They have phone trees. So all of you can go out and help us by something as simple as maybe doing your clearance could make a big difference. So there's little things that the own private homeowners can do to help us out as well.
And I know when you talked, Chief Pimlott, about social networks in your communities when the firefighters are away, you mentioned that some of the faith-based communities have been particularly helpful and generous in helping your families get by in your absence, and everybody ought to be alert to this. And I did want to mention that. Ken, in Australia, any comments on what folks can do to help the firefighters?
Well, the thing I encourage people to do most, or first and foremost, is to talk to their politicians and get them to realise that climate change is a real issue and that policies and resources need to be allocated based on climate. I think that's probably one of the most important things that people can do in the long term, and you're certainly helping with that. In Australia, the fire behaviour has changed so much. We have a graded system of warnings. They go from low, medium, high and extreme. It's probably very similar in the US. But over the last few years, the fires have become so much more intense, and the amount of time available to get to people and to get people away to evacuate people has become so much shorter that the Australian Fire Services have now introduced another level called catastrophic. So when there's a catastrophic alert, the message to the people is leave now. Don't wait for the fire, leave as soon as you can. If you can't leave, make sure that your house is defensible in some way, that you've done everything you possibly can before the fire arrives. And I'm not talking about hours, I'm talking about weeks and months before the fire arrives, to make your house as safe as possible. Because under a catastrophic alert, it's highly unlikely that the fire service is even going to be able to get to you. And when they're battling fires that involve 3,000 houses, the likelihood of them getting to any one house is quite low. They lose 3,000 houses. So how many houses and how many properties are they protecting? So the responsibility, it's a risk management problem. We're sharing the risk. The fire services will do what they can before the event. People need to do what they can do before the event, and during the event we both need to work together. And it takes some planning, and it takes quite a lot of public education to get that message through to people, because people don't live the life of fire. It's something that comes along every now and again and affects them. So there's a big learning curve that needs to take place within the community as well.
Yeah, well thank you. And I did want to underscore your very first comment. It reminded me of a point that I made yesterday in a different area of this, where the doctors in Canada were dealing with tick-borne diseases that they had never had to deal with before because the climate conditions are pushing them northward. And the Canadian Medical Association, after they did their diagnosis, they gave their prescription, and their prescription was the same as yours, to tell people to get out and talk to their politicians and do something about global warming and change the policy. So when you have doctors in Canada and firefighters in Australia and the US saying, from their very different professions and perspectives, get people mobilized to change the policies and laws so that we deal with global warming. That's a message that we've got to hear from these folks. They're putting their lives on the line. So let me shift gears a little bit. Chief Pimlott, in the area of policy, well, first of all, how the fires start. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the big majority of these fires end up being caused one way or another by people.
Correct.
And I know one of these fires, there was a car was driving along with, was it a trailer hitch or something, was scratching along the pavement, throwing off sparks, and that's where it came from. A small part, you'll find some cases of arson. You'll also find lightning strikes and power lines coming down. And we were talking earlier, and you all know this, but with each 1 degree increase in temperature, there's a 10 to 12% increase in lightning strikes. But most of the fires are actually caused directly or indirectly by human error. Is that correct?
It's correct. About 95% of the fires, pretty much nationally, are caused by people of some form.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the key point there. That means that obviously we can't control lightning, but we can affect change for the 95% of the fires that do occur. And we look at preventing fires. It's a broad brush approach. It's obviously people are held accountable when they negligently start a fire. But it's education. It's ensuring people understand how to recreate in the wildlands safely, how to properly use anything that has a heat source around the wildland. Don't mow your lawn or your weeds at the heat of the day. Martha was exactly right. It is a tinderbox. And I've been doing this for 30 years. The vegetation in this state, in the western United States, is changing. It is so receptive. We call it 100% probability of ignition, which means on any afternoon around the West, any spark that lands has a 100% chance of starting a fire. And you put a little bit of wind on that, and the fire quickly races away from firefighters to be able to contain that initial attack. It really is a tinderbox out there.
Now, one other related question. I've read and understood that some of the statistics on the sharp increase in the loss of homes and other buildings, but particularly homes in fires, is also due in part to people building in beautiful forested areas more than used to be the case. And I know there's all kind of controversy about this, but I want you to have a chance to say your piece about that also.
Go ahead.
Well, absolutely, from my perspective, 100% spot on that fire is a part of the landscape throughout the western United States and other parts of the world and the country, certainly. We have to build communities that are resistant to fire. Communities have to be resilient to be able to respond to the impacts when fires do occur. That means we need to build smartly. We need to put fire-resistive construction in place. We need to not build in places that we know are known fire corridors, at the top of drainages, in steep canyons where fires are channeled through and can have an intense impact. That's about local land use planning decisions that we need to keep making now. We've got lots of legacy construction that we are all out protecting every day because it was built many years ago, but we still have lots of choices to make about building smartly in the wildlands. And some of that decision may be not to build. There are just places we shouldn't be building because of these risks.
Yeah, did you want to comment on this? Good point.
I do agree, and it's a real difficult challenge, and I would take Big Sur as an example. We love living down there. We know it's dangerous. Our homes burn down, but to say we can't build there or somewhere else, it's a real difficult decision. But what we can do is, my house was stucco before. I lost a total of 3 homes, and I thought that was relatively safe. So now that we've rebuilt, we have what we call the WUI standards, the wildland-urban interface within our county at least. And so now I've built my 3 homes with called hardy board. It's a concrete board. And the eaves where those the embers were coming in like snowflakes, and we couldn't fight that. Well, now it's all one solid piece of this hardy board now. So there are things, if you do build where perhaps it's not the best idea. There's lots of things you can do with construction now and probably have to legally adhere to depending on where you're building.
Ken Thompson, have y'all faced this aspect of it in Australia also?
Yeah, exactly the same. As Ken was saying, we have a lot of legacy properties as well that have been built along ridge tops. They might have been built, 80, 100 years ago or more. The Blue Mountains just behind Sydney, it's a strip of, outcrop that probably, 60 kilometres of river development right along the top of the ridge top. Now those properties have been there for 100 years. There's no way in the world that we can, demolish those houses and start all over again. It's also one of the most fire-prone parts of New South Wales. So every few years, massive fires roar down through the gullies of the Blue Mountains, and then because the slopes have been heated so much during the day, the fire then burns up the slope, and of course engulfs the houses that are located along the ridge top. Now, when the legacy is there, we can't do much about that. But any new homes in New South Wales have to be built to a bushfire standard that takes into account quite a lot of the things that Martha was talking about. But also when those houses are rebuilt, they then have to be built to that same standard. And in that particular area, anybody who puts an application into the local council for any changes to be made to their house, the council will generally use that opportunity to get them to upgrade the rest of the house to bring that up to the fire standard for that particular area. So a lot of work's being done, but there's still an awful lot of property that is built to a very old construction standard.
Yeah, just a brief aside, I don't want to talk about floods here, but the same sort of policy issue arises with proposed new construction in known floodplain areas. It's a very similar issue.
Yes.
And Houston, Texas has had all of these big flood events, and a couple of weeks ago they just approved a massive rebuilding in a known floodplain where they've had repeated once in 1,000-year, once in 500-year floods. So this can be controversial, and of course property developers, when I was in my 20s, I was in a very small way one of them, so I know what it's like. But in aggregate, property developers are one of the biggest commercial interests in the entire country, and when there's pressure on the local governments to let them build, you see the natural result. But we need to listen to these fire and rescue, because you all respond to some in these flood emergencies also.
Yes.
So the policies are really, really important. What we heard in the Australia case how firefighters have spoken up on the issue of global warming, connected the dots. Have you seen successful cases here in the U.S. of firefighters organizing to speak out about this issue, or is it still too sensitive for most to get into it, or you're probably too busy to do it with fighting these fires actually, but you get my question.
I do, and we're certainly not as far evolved in having this discussion in the fire service as Australia is. I think the last several years we're getting hit right in the face with it, though. I think we're recognizing things are changing, and we can't just have the response piece and put more resources at this, because you continue to, more and more fire resources. Where does that end? And we have to look at the other side of this equation. We have to spend more time focusing on understanding the impacts. It's really the reality of the climate change, and what are the impacts it's having? What are these localized weather patterns that it's influencing? Not only to help firefighters better understand what they're facing, but to also turn that back around and help everyone else understand what these changes are doing on the ground. And I think we can then start having more of that conversation. And I anticipate next year will be just as bad a fire season, if not worse, than this year, the way the trend is going. And I think we have to be able to speak up and talk more about what's causing it.
I had some close friends in the Vietnam War who suffer still from post-traumatic stress disorder. That's got to be a problem for some of your firefighters too, doesn't it?
Absolutely is for us and for the firefighters around the United States. Not only are they're spending weeks, if not months, away from home all year. It puts pressures at home. The kinds of calls they're responding to, those things add up over time. And certainly when a firefighter loses a home, while they're battling saving somebody else's home, their own homes are burning down. And these things all add up over time.
Do we have enough help for the fire and rescue folks?
No.
No?
We are working on trying to get national attention to help firefighters get better support here.
Yeah. And we've got to support that. That's absolutely important. And the mental health agenda, of course, is urgent, and we see it raised in the context of gun violence. We see it in so many contexts, but this is one area where I think the public support can be increased for the mental health services that we need. And you've got that in, I'm sure you all have dealt with that in Australia, Ken.
Yeah, we have the same problem. I'd say, I mean, it's an issue, it's a very real issue. I don't know that the issue has been acknowledged enough in Australia. I know many firefighters who had to retire because of PTSD. And I think the support that they obtained while they were at work was probably far less than what was needed. And since they've retired, they tend to be on their own. They've had to form their own PTSD support networks. I'm quite involved with one of those networks. They seem to just be kind of thrown to the wolves, which is quite sad, really. They see a lot of death and destruction, not just wildfires. They see motor vehicle accidents, floods, storms. You name the whole range of disasters. And you draw the analogy with the military. It's a good analogy, but the difference is that the military people tend to do a tour of duty or a couple of tours of duty, then they come back home again. The firefighters are doing that tour of duty for 30, 35 years. They don't get a break. They don't get a rotation. They stay, particularly if they're frontline operational firefighters, it's just it's 30 odd years of seeing the same kinds of death and destruction and damage over and over and over again. And it's a cumulative problem. And unless there are support networks in place within the fire services to help deal with this, and we're getting much better at that, then these problems are just going to become worse and worse, because the types of emergencies and disasters we're responding to are far greater than they used to be.
Chief Carson's, as we heard, you lost your home. I want to acknowledge and send condolences on behalf of all of us to the 5 Californians not in fire and rescue who also have lost their lives this year in fires, 3 in the car fire alone. But I wanted to ask you about volunteer fire brigades. Do you have a lot of turnover? These are just citizens in your community who sign up and then show up when the need arises. Do you have the same core group that stays with you over a long period?
Well, it's a challenge, but if I may just backtrack one moment.
Sure.
When we were discussing the loss, we make very clear in Big Sur that your home is not worth any of my firefighters' lives, nor should it be for any of these firefighters who have been killed over the years. No one's home is worth that. So
right.
just to say that, to put that out there. Thank you. Yes, it was Big Sur Volunteer Fire Brigade, and now doing business as Big Sur Fire. And we were formed in 1974 just due to that need. A resident's home burned down, and we were waiting, actually, CAL FIRES who came down to help us then. Well, that was from town, which is 35 miles away, and obviously the home was lost prior to them getting there. We thought, this is just wrong. We need to do something about that. So our Big Sur Volunteer Fire Brigade was formed then, and we've grown over the years now. We're celebrating our 45th anniversary next year, and we provide all emergency services, fire, rescue, going to accidents, medical emergency.
Have you gotten any cats out of trees?
I was just going to say twice this year. We have, yes, we have. That was in my notes that I didn't bring on stage. Thank you for asking. Yes, we actually have done that, and the owners are so grateful. But,
and the cats are grateful.
and the cat was very
They may not show it, but
well, it was. But it is a challenge, and over the years we have people come and go. The challenges for us down there is housing in Big Sur is very limited, so where do our volunteers live? They need jobs. If they lose their jobs, then they leave. We just did a class recently where we brought on 8 new volunteers, and now 2 have already dropped out. They lost, one lost his housing, the other lost his job, and so had to go somewhere else. So Our numbers fluctuate. Now I'm up to 26, and it was 16. So these people are going out, and they're responding to over 300 calls a year. For a large department, that's not a lot. But for us, it's almost every day the volunteer is getting up, walking out, leaving the dinner table, leaving his family for anywhere from 2 to 12 hours going on a call. So we do have people in the community who step up, and you do have to live in our response area, which is 58.3 miles of scenic Highway 1 that we cover. And it's very difficult to find volunteers because it's a big commitment. Our training requirements have gotten more and more. We train the same as professional paid fire departments do. And that's a real difficult challenge just to begin with, not to mention going out and answering calls after that. So it's always and always has been a challenge to keep volunteers, but fortunately we have had community residents step up and help us out.
My home in Tennessee as a boy was in Middle Tennessee, but my mother's family was from West Tennessee and Jackson, and her youngest brother, Everett LaFawn, was a professional firefighter in the Jackson, Tennessee Fire Department. And oh gosh, I remember so vividly going with him down to the fire station and looking up at all those heroic firefighters there and looking at the shiny engines and everything. You all really occupy a special place in the imagination of your communities and your countries. We want to. It's a great commitment that you make. I guess what I'm wanting to ask is something you've already said. I'm trying to ask it in a fresh way. When I see political leaders on television sometimes saying this whole threat of the climate crisis is just imaginary and a hoax, you can imagine my reaction, but I'm trying to imagine your reaction. And if you had a chance to address those kinds of politicians who say it's not real and we should just ignore it, what would you say to them?
I think I would invite them to come out to the fire line with our firefighters.
Yeah. Good answer.
They're seeing it firsthand, and I go out there with them, and they talk about how it's not the same and how this is different. And they're just now starting to put it all together.
Yeah, well, none too quickly. Did you want to, you said something earlier, and you may want to leave it at that, but if you'd want to say something directly to them, I'll give you the chance.
To the politicians?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I'm a volunteer.
You don't have a boss, do you?
I was going to say, I am a volunteer. I'm my own boss. I can say whatever I want, unlike my friend here.
He's doing a pretty good job, though.
Don't get me in trouble, Martha.
No. These people, and I'm going to give a plug to the United States Forest Service, with who we deal with frequently in Big Sur. They need more money. They need to have more personnel on engines. If you picture a small little engine with 500 gallons of water and 3 people on board fighting these massive fires, it's absurd that they can do anything. They need more money for pay. They have positions that are not being filled at all, I know, with the engines in Big Sur. And I think everyone across the board all needs to have these politicians come forward and, however they do it, pass some bills to fund these people who are out there risking their lives and losing their lives fighting fires.
Yeah. Ken, in Australia, I know you've had this opportunity. Y'all have had something like 6 prime ministers in 7 years, and every single one of these leadership changes, climate policy's been right in the fulcrum of the change, and here you've got a country that's in the bullseye of the climate crisis for reasons that the scientists have explained vividly in Australia, but it's also the world's largest coal exporter, so the political system is pulled in 2 different directions, and I guess maybe you've had a chance to talk directly to politicians, but if you could say it plainly to them, what would you say?
I have spoken to politicians, and I'm far less constrained in what I say now than I was a few years ago when I was working for government. I did have a meeting with the shadow environment minister, so the opposition environment minister, and he described the climate policy to me as the poison chalice of politics. Nobody wanted to touch it because it just, as you said, it tends to bring down politicians. It's brought down several prime ministers in Australia, including one just this week. It's a very difficult issue for us because at the moment we have a very, very conservative government, very right-wing government, and it seems to me that no amount of pointing to the science and no amount of pointing to the disasters that are taking place across the country, whether they be drought, whether they be fire, whether they be flood or cyclone or whatever.
Great Barrier Reef.
Exactly. 60% of the Great Barrier Reef is being destroyed because of the increased temperature of the water. Yet the politicians, the current politicians in the current government anyway, just dismiss the whole thing. They dismiss the science. They dismiss the events. They just simply say things like, well, one major forest fire isn't evidence that, that climate change has contributed to this fire. It's really hard to get them to look across a whole range of events over a long period of time. And I think a lot of it comes back to what you said just a moment ago, is that, we've got a very, very big and very powerful fossil fuel industry in Australia. I think a lot of contributions are made by that industry to the political parties, and I think there's a kind of an expectation that, that the policies will not infringe too much onto their businesses. I think, most Australians can see it. Something like 70, 75, 80% of Australians believe that climate change is a real issue, and a similar number believe that the government needs to introduce policies based on the science to address the consequences. But the current government just continually brushes it aside. So, you could bring them out to a fire line, you put them into a cyclone area. The current Prime Minister is currently in a drought-affected area. And when he was asked whether there was any connection to climate change, he said, I'm not prepared to have that discussion at the moment.
Yeah, well, they're going to have that discussion, and our job here is to make sure they have that discussion, and no pun intended, it needs to be a heated discussion because this is getting so ridiculous, and that's why all these 2,200 people are here to learn the skills to be more effective in communicating this message. So before we close, we're just about out of time. I'm really inspired by the three of you, and you can feel the love in this room. We appreciate what you do, but I want to give each of the three of you a chance to make any final statement that you'd like. Chief, if you want to start.
Well, I want to say thank you, and I do feel the love in the room, and thank you for the passion you have in not giving up on this. And the firefighters need that are out there for us every day. We have a lot of work to do, both in education, but we've got a lot of work to do to help them get better tools to, how we're applying what's happening with these changes on the ground so they can be more effective and they can do it more safely. And those are the kinds of asks we really need to help our firefighters. But I really, again, just want to express my heartfelt thanks to all of you in this room and everyone outside of this room who is so engaged in this project. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Chief Carsons?
I would say that I applaud all of you for being here, like you applauded us. You've taken time, I'm sure, away from your families and work to come out here, and this is how the word will get spread for all of you going out around the country and saying what we have said with our examples here and everything you're learning throughout the week here. So I applaud all of you for being here, and thank you very much for doing it.
Thank you for those comments. Any last words from Oz?
Well, as I said before, Mr. Gore trained me as a climate ambassador, quite a few years ago now, and I've been out spreading that message, delivering those presentations for well over 10 years now, and I know that one person can have an impact. I get so many people who come up to me after those presentations and say, now I get it, now I understand, it didn't make sense before. Sure, there are a few people who might challenge me and might challenge the science, but the vast majority of people, once it's been explained to them, they understand it and they go and they do something. They act on the message. And I encourage every single one of you to get out there and do as many of these presentations as you possibly can. Whether it's to 5 people or whether it's to 2,200 people, you will have a very, very positive impact on people.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. By the way, I neglected to mention that Ken Thompson is a trained climate leader. He went through one of the trainings for climate reality in Australia some years ago and has been out giving the slideshow and making speeches in his spare time. And I really appreciate that. And we are going to have a training next June, our 4th training in Australia in Brisbane. And we're going to have some firefighters from Australia there, and we're collecting folks from all the Pacific Island nations, inviting them to come as well. So we'll see you in Brisbane. But ladies and gentlemen, I know that you want to join me in expressing heartfelt thanks to all 3 of these firefighters for being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. You did great. Thank you. Thank you so much.